Desert Daughter's Story. Part 3. The village elder, who introduced himself as Abu Rashid, invited them to share tea in his modest home. The traditional hospitality was overwhelming after months of military rations and hostile environments. Marcus found himself sitting cross-legged on woven carpets, trying to follow conversations that switched between Arabic, English, and what sounded like ancient tribal dialects. Abu Rashid's wife, Rashid, brought out plates of flatbread, olives, and cheese that tasted like heaven to the exhausted travelers. But Marcus noticed how the three sisters hesitated before eating, their eyes constantly scanning for exits and threats. Months of captivity had taught them that kindness could be a trap. "Your military will come looking," Abu Rashid said matter-of-factly in accented English. "They always do when something valuable goes missing." Marcus nodded grimly.
"How long do you think we have?"
"Perhaps 2 days before they think to search here. We are neutral, but that means little to armies when they want something badly enough." The weight of his decision was settling on Marcus like desert sand. He had saved 3 lives, but possibly doomed an entire village to military inspection or worse. The thought made him sick to his stomach. Amira seemed to read his thoughts. "We cannot stay here long," she said quietly. "It puts too many people at risk." But Abu Rashid held up a weathered hand. "There is another way. My nephew Hassan runs a network that helps refugees reach the coast. From there, boats cross to countries where the war cannot follow." "Hassan?" Layla perked up at the familiar name. "Like our father?" "A common name," the elder smiled. "But perhaps a good sign nonetheless." That evening, as Marcus walked through the village, he was struck by how normal life could seem even in the shadow of conflict. Children chased goats through narrow streets while their mothers prepared dinner over open fires. Old men played backgammon outside a small shop that sold everything from batteries to prayer rugs. It was the kind of community his grandmother had described from her childhood in rural Mexico, where everyone knew everyone, and survival depended on mutual support. Yasmin had found a corner where she could sketch by lamplight. Already she was capturing scenes from the village. A woman weaving at her loom. Children gathered around a storyteller, the geometric patterns carved into the mosque's wooden doors. Her art was becoming a bridge between worlds, documenting beauty in places where others saw only conflict. "You draw very well," said a voice behind them. Marcus turned to see a young man approaching, perhaps in his early 20s. "I am Hassan, Abu Rashid's nephew. I understand you need to reach the coast." Hassan was lean and weathered, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their situation. He wore traditional robes over modern hiking boots, a combination that somehow epitomized the complexity of their circumstances. "The journey is dangerous," Hassan continued. 3 days through mountains where government forces patrol, then 2 days across open country to reach the fishing villages. Even if we make it, the boat passage is expensive and uncertain." "How expensive?" Marcus asked, though he suspected his soldiers' pay wouldn't cover whatever was required. $2,000 American dollars per person, plus additional for emergency supplies and backup routes. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. Even with his savings, he couldn't cover the cost for all 3 sisters. But before he could respond, Amira spoke up. "We have money hidden in our family's house. If someone could retrieve it." Hassan shook his head. "The house has been searched multiple times. Government forces are using it as a temporary base. Getting inside would be suicide." The conversation continued late into the night, exploring various options and contingencies. Hassan's network was sophisticated, with safe houses, communication codes, and contacts throughout the region. But every route came with significant risks and costs. Finally, Hassan made an unexpected offer. "There is one possibility. My cousin works at the port in Latakia. She helps process refugee documents for the United Nations. If we could get official refugee status for the sisters, the UN would cover transportation costs." "What would that require?" Marcus asked. "Proof of persecution, documented evidence of threats to their safety, and testimony from credible witnesses." Hassan looked directly at Marcus. A statement from an American soldier describing their illegal detention and planned abuse would carry significant weight. The implication was clear. Marcus would have to formally accuse his own military of war crimes, essentially ending any chance of returning to his old life. It would mean permanent exile, criminal charges, and separation from his own family. Marcus excused himself and walked outside into the cool desert air. The stars were brilliant in the unpolluted sky, reminding him of nights when he was young and believed the world was fundamentally good. He thought about Sophia, probably studying for finals at her university. She would understand his choice, he knew, but she would also worry about never seeing him again. When he returned to the house, he found the three sisters whispering together in rapid Arabic. Amira looked up as he entered. "We have been discussing our situation," she said formally. "We cannot ask you to sacrifice your entire future for us. Perhaps there is another way." "What kind of other way?" Yasmin answered this time. "Our father has contacts in the resistance movement. If we could get word to him about our location, he might be able to arrange our extraction through different channels." Marcus shook his head immediately. That would mean armed conflict, probably right here in this village. People would die. "People are already dying," Layla said with the bitter wisdom of someone too young to understand such things. "At least this way we choose which people." The moral complexity of their situation was overwhelming. Every choice seemed to require someone else's sacrifice. Every path forward was built on others' graves. Hassan returned the next morning with disturbing news. Radio chatter indicated that military search teams were expanding their sweep pattern. They had roughly 18 hours before patrols reached the area around Al-Muqtara. "We must decide today," Hassan said. "The UN route requires paperwork that takes time to process. The family extraction would bring immediate danger. Or..." He paused, studying Marcus carefully. "You could all return, claim the sisters overpowered you, stole the truck, forced you to drive here. With proper coaching, the story might be believable." "And what happens to them?" Marcus asked. "Prison, interrogation, probably worse. But you would be safe." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus looked at each of the sisters in turn. Amira trying to be strong for her younger siblings. Yasmin sketching frantically as if art could make sense of their impossible situation. Layla holding on to childhood innocence despite everything that had been stolen from her. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I need to make a phone call." "Hassan, can your people get a message to someone in America?" "Possibly." "What kind of message?" Marcus pulled out a worn photograph of his family, his mother, his three sisters, and himself at Sophia's high school graduation. Everyone was smiling, believing in futures that seemed guaranteed. "I need to tell my sister that her big brother is about to do something that will make her proud, even if it means we might not see each other for a very long time." Hassan nodded slowly. "I understand. But remember, once we start down this path, there is no returning to your old life." "I know," Marcus replied, surprising himself with how calm he felt. "Maybe it's time for a new life anyway." As the afternoon heat shimmered across the desert, Marcus began dictating a letter that would document everything he had witnessed, everything he knew about the treatment of prisoners, and everything he was willing to sacrifice to ensure that three innocent young women could have a chance at freedom. The die was cast. Their fate now depended on paperwork, connections, and the hope that somewhere in the world people still cared about doing the right thing. Desert Daughter's Story, Part 2. The military transport arrived at dawn, kicking up clouds of sand that painted the morning sky red. Marcus watched from his post as two officers stepped out, carrying transfer documents and restraints. He had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, memorizing every detail of his plan, calculating every risk. Captain Williams approached Marcus with the paperwork. "Rodriguez, we're here for the Hassan girls. Command wants them separated for enhanced interrogation. You'll escort the eldest to the northern facility." Marcus felt his heart pound against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. "Actually, sir, I've received different orders." He pulled out forged documents he had spent hours creating, using letterhead and signatures he had carefully studied from previous transfers. "I'm to transport all three subjects to the Psychological Evaluation Center at Kandahar. Command believes keeping them together will make them more compliant." Captain Williams frowned, examining the papers. Marcus held his breath, knowing that discovery meant court-martial at best, execution at worst. But his forgery skills, learned during a brief stint in military intelligence, proved convincing enough. "Unusual approach," Williams muttered. "But Command has been trying new tactics lately." "Very well. You'll need additional transport for 3 prisoners." "Already arranged, sir. I have a requisitioned vehicle waiting." Marcus gestured toward a modified military truck he had prepared during the night. The vehicle was real, though his authorization to use it was entirely fictional. Within an hour, Marcus found himself driving through the desert with 3 confused and frightened young women in the back of his truck. He had told them nothing of his plan, knowing that hope could be more dangerous than despair if his scheme failed. But as miles of sand stretched between them and the military compound, Marcus finally allowed himself to breathe. Amira was the first to speak. "This is not the direction to any facility we know about," she said in careful English. "Where are you taking us?" Marcus met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Somewhere safe, I hope." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Yasmin clutched her sister's hand while Layla stared out the small window at the endless dunes. They had learned not to trust easily, especially not soldiers who claimed to want to help. "Why?" Amira finally asked. "Why would you risk this for us?" Marcus thought about his answer carefully. "Because you remind me that not everyone in this war is an enemy. Because you're somebody's daughters and they deserve to have you come home." The truth was more complicated than that. Marcus had grown up poor in East Texas, watching his mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table after his father died. He had joined the military partly for the steady pay, partly for the college benefits, and partly because he believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Somewhere along the way, that mission had gotten twisted into something he no longer recognized. As they drove deeper into the desert, Marcus explained his plan. There was a small village called Al-Mukhtara about 200 miles west near the border. It was controlled by tribal leaders who maintained neutrality in the conflict, offering sanctuary to refugees regardless of their background. Marcus had heard about it from local interpreters who spoke of it in whispers, like a mythical place where the war couldn't reach. But getting there meant crossing through territory controlled by 3 different factions, each suspicious of outsiders. They would have to navigate checkpoints, avoid patrol routes, and somehow explain why an American soldier was transporting 3 young women across the desert. The first checkpoint came sooner than expected. Marcus's heart raced as he saw armed guards ahead, but he forced himself to maintain the steady speed of a routine transport. He handed over his identification and the forged transfer orders, praying that news of their disappearance hadn't reached this remote outpost yet. The guard studied the papers while his partner shone a flashlight into the back of the truck. Yasmin whispered something to Layla in Arabic, and the youngest sister began to cough violently. It was convincing enough that the guard stepped back, apparently concerned about contagion. "Medical transport," Marcus explained. "Possible infection. Orders are to get them to the isolation facility quickly." The guards waved them through without further inspection, but Marcus knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. Word would spread about the missing prisoners, and soon every checkpoint would be looking for them. As the sun climbed higher, the heat inside the truck became unbearable. Marcus rationed their water carefully, knowing they had a long journey ahead. During a brief stop to check the engine, Amira approached him privately. "If you are caught helping us, what will happen to you?" she asked. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Court-martial, prison, may be worse depending on how they classify what I'm doing. Then why continue? You could still turn back, claim we overpowered you somehow." Marcus looked at her serious, intelligent face and saw an old soul, carrying too much responsibility. "When I was your age, my little sister got sick. Really sick. The doctors said she needed an operation our family couldn't afford. A neighbor, someone we barely knew, heard about our situation and paid for the entire surgery. When my mother asked why, he said that sometimes we get chances to be the person we needed when we were young." Amira considered this for a long moment. "Your sister, is she well now?" "She's studying to be a teacher. She wants to help kids who grow up like we did." Marcus smiled despite their circumstances. "Sophia always said that education is the one thing nobody can take away from you, no matter how poor you are or what war is happening around you." "I wanted to be a teacher too," Yasmin said quietly from the back of the truck. "Before all this happened." "Maybe you still can be," Marcus replied. "Maybe that's why we're doing this." The afternoon brought new challenges. Marcus's radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications about the missing prisoners and their guard. Roadblocks were being established. Search helicopters were being deployed. Their window of opportunity was rapidly closing, but they had covered significant ground and the landscape was changing. The flat desert gave way to rocky hills and occasional vegetation. They were entering territory where the central government's control was weak, where tribal law held more authority than military commands. As evening approached, they reached the outskirts of Al-Muqtara. The village appeared suddenly from behind a ridge like something from another century. Adobe buildings clustered around a central well, with terraced gardens climbing the hillsides. Children played in the dusty streets while women carried water jugs on their heads. It was a scene of normal life that seemed impossible in a war zone, but their arrival did not go unnoticed. Armed men emerged from various buildings surrounding the truck before Marcus could even turn off the engine. The village leader, an elderly man with kind eyes and calloused hands, approached slowly. Marcus raised his hands in a gesture of peace and began to explain their situation in his limited Arabic. But before he could finish, Amira stepped out of the truck and began speaking rapidly in what sounded like a different dialect. The conversation continued for several minutes, with gestures toward Marcus and her sisters. Finally, the village leader nodded and spoke to his men. The weapons were lowered, and Marcus felt the tension leave his shoulders for the first time in hours. "What did you tell him?" Marcus asked. Amira smiled for the first time since their journey began. "The truth, that you risked everything to save 3 strangers because you believe in something bigger than the war. He says such actions deserve protection, not punishment." As the sun set over Al-Muqtara, Marcus realized that the most difficult part of their journey was just beginning. They were safe for now, but permanent sanctuary would require careful negotiation, cultural understanding, and a level of trust that war made nearly impossible to achieve. Desert Daughter's Story, Part 3. The village elder, who introduced himself as Abu Rashid, invited them to share tea in his modest home. The traditional hospitality was overwhelming after months of military rations and hostile environments. Marcus found himself sitting cross-legged on woven carpets, trying to follow conversations that switched between Arabic, English, and what sounded like ancient tribal dialects. Abu Rashid's wife, Rashid, brought out plates of flatbread, olives, and cheese that tasted like heaven to the exhausted travelers. But Marcus noticed how the 3 sisters hesitated before eating, their eyes constantly scanning for exits and threats. Months of captivity had taught them that kindness could be a trap. "Your military will come looking," Abu Rashid said matter-of-factly in accented English. "They always do when something valuable goes missing." Marcus nodded grimly. "How long do you think we have?" "Perhaps 2 days before they think to search here. We are neutral, but that means little to armies when they want something badly enough." The weight of his decision was settling on Marcus like desert sand. He had saved 3 lives, but possibly doomed an entire village to military inspection or worse. The thought made him sick to his stomach. Amira seemed to read his thoughts. "We cannot stay here long," she said quietly. "It puts too many people at risk." But Abu Rashid held up a weathered hand. "There is another way. My nephew Hassan runs a network that helps refugees reach the coast. From there, boats cross to countries where the war cannot follow." "Hassan?" Layla perked up at the familiar name. "Like our father?" "A common name," the elder smiled. "But perhaps a good sign nonetheless." That evening, as Marcus walked through the village, he was struck by how normal life could seem even in the shadow of conflict. Children chased goats through narrow streets while their mothers prepared dinner over open fires. Old men played backgammon outside a small shop that sold everything from batteries to prayer rugs. It was the kind of community his grandmother had described from her childhood in rural Mexico, where everyone knew everyone, and survival depended on mutual support. Yasmin had found a corner where she could sketch by lamplight. Already she was capturing scenes from the village, a woman weaving at her loom, children gathered around a storyteller, the geometric patterns carved into the mosque's wooden doors. Her art was becoming a bridge between worlds, documenting beauty in places where others saw only conflict. "You draw very well," said a voice behind them. Marcus turned to see a young man approaching, perhaps in his early 20s. "I am Hassan, Abu Rashid's nephew. I understand you need to reach the coast." Hassan was lean and weathered, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their situation. He wore traditional robes over modern hiking boots, a combination that somehow epitomized the complexity of their circumstances. "The journey is dangerous," Hassan continued. 3 days through mountains where government forces patrol, Then 2 days across open country to reach the fishing villages. Even if we make it, the boat passage is expensive and uncertain. How expensive? Marcus asked, though he suspected his soldiers' pay wouldn't cover whatever was required. $2,000 per person, plus additional for emergency supplies and backup routes. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. Even with his savings, he couldn't cover the cost for all 3 sisters. But before he could respond, Amira spoke up. "We have money hidden in our family's house. If someone could retrieve it." Hassan shook his head. "The house has been searched multiple times. Government forces are using it as a temporary base. Getting inside would be suicide." The conversation continued late into the night, exploring various options and contingencies. Hassan's network was sophisticated with safe houses, communication codes, and contacts throughout the region. But every route came with significant risks and costs. Finally, Hassan made an unexpected offer. "There is one possibility. My cousin works at the port in Latakia. She helps process refugee documents for the United Nations. If we could get official refugee status for the sisters, the UN would cover transportation costs." "What would that require?" Marcus asked. "Proof of persecution, documented evidence of threats to their safety, and testimony from credible witnesses." Hassan looked directly at Marcus. A statement from an American soldier describing their illegal detention and planned abuse would carry significant weight. The implication was clear. Marcus would have to formally accuse his own military of war crimes, essentially ending any chance of returning to his old life. It would mean permanent exile, criminal charges, and separation from his own family. Marcus excused himself and walked outside into the cool desert air. The stars were brilliant in the unpolluted sky, reminding him of nights when he was young and believed the world was fundamentally good. He thought about Sophia, probably studying for finals at her university. She would understand his choice, he knew, but she would also worry about never seeing him again. When he returned to the house, he found the 3 sisters whispering together in rapid Arabic. Amira looked up as he entered. "We have been discussing our situation," she said formally. "We cannot ask you to sacrifice your entire future for us. Perhaps there is another way." "What kind of other way?" Yasmin answered this time. "Our father has contacts in the resistance movement. If we could get word to him about our location, he might be able to arrange our extraction through different channels." Marcus shook his head immediately. "That would mean armed conflict, probably right here in this village. People would die." "People are already dying," Layla said with the bitter wisdom of someone too young to understand such things. "At least this way we choose which people." The moral complexity of their situation was overwhelming. Every choice seemed to require someone else's sacrifice. Every path forward was built on others' graves. Hassan returned the next morning with disturbing news. Radio chatter indicated that military search teams were expanding their sweep pattern. They had roughly 18 hours before patrols reached the area around Al-Muqtara. "We must decide today," Hassan said. "The UN route requires paperwork that takes time to process. The family extraction would bring immediate danger, or..." He paused, studying Marcus carefully. "You could all return. Claim the sisters overpowered you, stole the truck, forced you to drive here. With proper coaching, the story might be believable." "And what happens to them?" Marcus asked. "Prison, interrogation, probably worse. But you would be safe." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus looked at each of the sisters in turn. Amira, trying to be strong for her younger siblings. Yasmin sketching frantically as if art could make sense of their impossible situation. Layla, holding on to childhood innocence despite everything that had been stolen from her. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I need to make a phone call. Hassan, can your people get a message to someone in America?" "Possibly." "What kind of message?" Marcus pulled out a worn photograph of his family, his mother, his 3 sisters, and himself at Sophia's high school graduation. Everyone was smiling, believing in futures that seemed guaranteed. "I need to tell my sister that her big brother is about to do something that will make her proud, even if it means we might not see each other for a very long time." Hassan nodded slowly. "I understand. But remember, once we start down this path, there is no returning to your old life." "I know," Marcus replied, surprising himself with how calm he felt. Maybe it's time for a new life anyway. As the afternoon heat shimmered across the desert, Marcus began dictating a letter that would document everything he had witnessed, everything he knew about the treatment of prisoners, and everything he was willing to sacrifice to ensure that 3 innocent young women could have a chance at freedom. The die was cast. Their fate now depended on paperwork, connections, and the hope that somewhere in the world, people still cared about doing the right thing. Desert Daughter Story, Part 4. The UN refugee documentation process moved with agonizing slowness while time ran out around them. Hassan's contact in Latakia, a woman named Dr. Rima Khalil, required extensive paperwork, witness statements, and medical evaluations. Each form seemed designed to discourage rather than help, filled with bureaucratic language that turned human suffering into administrative categories. Marcus spent hours crafting his official statement, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by lawyers, military investigators, and international human rights organizations. He documented the illegal detention, the psychological pressure tactics, the planned separation of the sisters, and his own growing realization that the military operation had crossed fundamental moral boundaries. "Listen to this bureaucratic nonsense," Hassan muttered, reading from one of the forms. The applicant must demonstrate credible fear of persecution based on political opinion, religious belief, ethnic background, or membership in a particular social group. He threw the paper down in disgust. What about because they are human beings who deserve not to be tortured? But Dr. Khalil proved to be more than just another bureaucrat. When she arrived in Al-Mukhtara the next morning, Marcus immediately understood why Hassan trusted her. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and calloused hands, someone who had clearly seen the worst of the refugee crisis, but maintained her compassion despite it all. She interviewed each sister separately, documenting their experiences with professional thoroughness but personal warmth. When she spoke with Yasmin, she spent extra time examining the girl's artwork, recognizing how trauma had influenced the themes and techniques. "Art therapy is something we use extensively with young refugees," Dr. Khalil explained. "The way someone processes their experiences through creative expression often reveals trauma that formal interviews miss." The medical evaluations were more difficult. All 3 sisters showed signs of stress-related health problems, weight loss, sleep disorders, anxiety symptoms that had become physical manifestations. But proving that these conditions resulted from persecution rather than general war exposure required careful documentation. Most challenging was establishing their credible fear of future persecution. Colonel Hassan's continued resistance to interrogation meant his daughters remained valuable leverage. Simply returning them to their family would not guarantee safety, since military forces could easily recapture them. The strongest case would involve relocation to a third country, Dr. Khalil explained during a private conversation with Marcus. But that requires sponsors, financial guarantees, and extensive background checks. The process typically takes months, sometimes years. "We don't have months," Marcus replied. "We barely have days, I understand. There is one alternative, emergency refugee status based on imminent threat to life. But it requires extraordinary evidence and high-level intervention." That evening, as they waited for word about their applications, Marcus found himself talking with Abu Rashid about the nature of moral courage. The village elder had lived through multiple conflicts, seeing governments rise and fall while his community endured through adaptation and mutual support. "You know," Abu Rashid said, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully, "in our tradition, there is a concept called saving one life saves all humanity. When you chose to protect these girls, you were not just helping 3 individuals. You were preserving the possibility that goodness can still triumph over evil. But at what cost?" Marcus asked. "I've destroyed my career, probably put your village at risk, and we still don't know if any of this will work." "Ah, but you are thinking like a soldier, calculating victory and defeat. Think instead like a father, like a brother. What would you want someone to do if your Sophia was in their situation?" The wisdom in those words struck Marcus deeply. He had been so focused on the mechanics of rescue that he had lost sight of the fundamental human equation. These were somebody's daughters, and they deserved the same protection he would want for his own family. News arrived the next morning that changed everything. Hassan burst into their hiding place with a radio message from Dr. Khalil. The U.S. State Department had received Marcus's formal complaint about prisoner treatment, triggering an immediate investigation. More importantly, International human rights organizations were now aware of the case and applying pressure for emergency intervention. The good news, Hassan reported, is that your statement has created enough political attention to fast-track the refugee applications. The bad news is that it has also intensified the military search for all of you. Dr. Khalil's voice crackled over the radio as Hassan established a secure connection. Marcus, your courage in filing this complaint has saved lives, but it has also made you a target. Military intelligence is classifying you as a deserter and possible enemy collaborator. There will be no going back to your old life. The finality of those words hit Marcus harder than he had expected. Even knowing this outcome was likely, hearing it confirmed felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he had worked for, every relationship he had built, every plan he had made for his future, all of it was gone. But when he looked at the three sisters, he saw something that made the loss bearable. Hope. For the first time since their capture, they were looking toward a future instead of just trying to survive another day. The emergency refugee status came through that afternoon, along with transportation arrangements to a UN processing center in Turkey. From there, permanent resettlement would be arranged in a country willing to accept them, possibly Canada, possibly several European nations that had committed to helping Syrian refugees. The paperwork also included an unexpected provision. Marcus, as the primary witness to their persecution, could apply for asylum himself based on credible fear of retaliation for his testimony. It would mean permanent exile from the United States, but it also meant the possibility of a new life built on the foundation of doing the right thing. That final evening in Al-Muhtara, the entire village gathered to wish them well. Children brought flowers and small gifts. Women packed food for their journey. Men offered prayers and blessings in multiple languages. It was a ceremony of hope, a community's way of sending good intentions into an uncertain world. Yasmin presented Marcus with a sketch she had drawn during their stay, the four of them sitting together under the desert stars, looking not like a soldier and his prisoners, but like a makeshift family finding strength in each other. At the bottom, she had written in careful English, "Thank you for showing us that kindness is stronger than fear." Abu Rashid pulled Marcus aside for a final conversation. "You came here as a warrior, but you are leaving as a protector. That transformation changes not just your destiny, but theirs as well. Remember that when the difficult days come." As they prepared to leave the next morning, Marcus realized that the person climbing into Hassan's transport vehicle was fundamentally different from the soldier who had made a desperate decision just days earlier. He was still the same man who had grown up poor in Texas, who had joined the military to support his family, who worried about his sister's safety. But he was also someone who had learned that true strength comes from protecting the vulnerable, even when that protection requires enormous personal sacrifice. The convoy of vehicles that would take them to the Turkish border was modest but well organized. Hassan had arranged multiple routes, backup transportation, and emergency communication systems. They would travel at night through mountain passes that offered concealment, but presented significant risks. As Al-Muhtara disappeared behind them in the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus felt the weight of choices that could never be undone. He was crossing more than just geographical borders. He was leaving behind one version of himself and stepping into another that he was only beginning to understand. Beside him, Amira watched the landscape change through the vehicle's window. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Marcus considered the question carefully. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also more certain than I've ever been about anything. Sometimes the right choice is also the scariest one. Our father used to say that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear," she replied. "I think you understand that now." The road ahead was uncertain, full of checkpoints and patrols and 1,000 things that could go wrong. But for the first time in months, they were traveling toward hope instead of away from it. That made all the difference in the world. The encounter reminded them that they were not alone on these mountains. Other people were using this route for their own purposes, and not all of them would be sympathetic to refugees seeking safety. As they climbed higher, the weather began to deteriorate. What had started as light wind became a steady gale that cut through their clothing like knives. Snow began falling, not the gentle flakes of a peaceful winter evening, but hard pellets driven by wind that made visibility nearly impossible. Marcus realized they were in serious trouble. The combination of altitude, cold, and exhaustion was affecting all of them, but especially the sisters who had already been weakened by months of captivity. Yasmin was having difficulty keeping her footing on the increasingly icy trail, and Amira was showing signs of altitude sickness. But turning back was no longer an option. They had climbed too far to return safely, and the military search below would have intensified during their absence. The only way out was forward, through whatever the mountain demanded of them. As they approached what Hassan identified as the halfway point, Marcus looked back at the three young women who had trusted him with their lives. They were exhausted, frightened, and pushed beyond their physical limits. But they were also still moving, still fighting, still believing that freedom lay somewhere ahead in the darkness. The most difficult part of their journey was yet to come, but they had already proven that human determination could overcome circumstances that seemed impossible. One step at a time, they continued climbing toward a future that remained uncertain but was no longer completely hopeless. Desert Daughter's Story, Part 6. The storm intensified as they reached the tree line, where sparse pine trees gave way to exposed rock and ice. The wind became a living thing, howling between the peaks and driving snow into their faces with such force that breathing became a conscious effort. Marcus tied a rope around his waist and connected it to each of the sisters, ensuring they wouldn't become separated in the whiteout conditions. Layla collapsed after another hour of climbing. She simply sat down in the snow and refused to move. Her lips blew with cold despite the hand warmers Hassan had provided. Marcus knelt beside her, recognizing the early signs of hypothermia in her glassy stare and slurred speech. "I can't feel my feet," she whispered. "I just want to sleep for a little while." Marcus knew that sleep meant death at this altitude and temperature. He pulled emergency rations from his pack and forced her to eat high-energy chocolate, then began the painful process of checking her extremities for frostbite. Her fingers were white and stiff but still showed circulation when he pressed them. "Listen to me, Layla," he said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "We are going to make it over this mountain, and you are going to live to become a teacher like you dreamed. But I need you to keep moving. Can you do that for me?" She nodded weakly, but Marcus could see that willpower alone wouldn't be enough. He made the difficult decision to carry her, knowing that the additional weight would exhaust him quickly, but seeing no alternative. Hassan scouted ahead while Marcus adjusted his pack to distribute Layla's weight more efficiently. When the guide returned, his expression was grim. "The main trail is blocked by an avalanche probably triggered by the storm. We must take a more dangerous route along the ridge, but it exposes us to the full force of the wind." The alternative route required technical climbing skills that none of them possessed. They would have to traverse narrow ledges with 100-foot drops, cross ice fields where a single misstep meant certain death, and navigate by feel in conditions where visibility extended only a few feet. But they had come too far to turn back. Military patrols were certainly searching the lower elevations by now, and the storm that made their climb more dangerous also provided cover from aerial surveillance. The ridge crossing took 3 hours that felt like an eternity. Marcus went first, testing each step and calling back warnings about loose rocks or icy patches. Amira followed, then Yasmin, with Hassan bringing up the rear. They moved one step at a time, resting frequently, speaking little to conserve energy. During one of these rest stops, huddled against a rock formation that provided minimal shelter from the wind, Yasmin pulled out her sketchbook. With numb fingers, she drew quick images of their journey. Marcus carrying Layla, the sisters roped together against the storm, Hassan pointing toward distant peaks. "Why are you drawing now?" Amira asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Because if we don't survive this, someone should know that we tried," Yasmin replied. "And if we do survive, I want to remember what courage looks like." Her words carried a truth that gave them all strength to continue. They were not just fleeing toward safety, they were proving something about human resilience, about the lengths people will go to protect each other, about the power of hope even in the most desperate circumstances. The descent began just before dawn, though the storm clouds made it impossible to tell when day officially arrived. The trail wound through a series of switchbacks that would have been treacherous in good conditions but became nearly impossible in the ice and snow. It was during this descent that Marcus made a mistake that nearly cost them everything. Exhausted from carrying Layla and disoriented by the storm, He misread the trail markers and led them down a path that dead-ended at a cliff face. By the time they realized the error, they had lost precious time and energy, and the storm was worsening. Hassan studied their surroundings carefully, then made an announcement that chilled them more than the mountain wind. "We are lost. The trail I know is not here. We must find shelter and wait for the storm to pass, or we will all die of exposure." The shelter they found was a shallow cave, barely large enough for 4 people but offering protection from the wind. They huddled together for warmth while Hassan tried to get his bearings using a compass and what little visibility the storm allowed. As they waited, Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of decisions that had brought them to this moment. Every choice had seemed reasonable at the time, but the cumulative effect had led them to a place where survival was no longer certain. "Do you regret helping us?" Amira asked quietly. Marcus considered the question as he watched Layla sleeping fitfully against Yasmin's shoulder. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the world is arranged in a way that makes this kind of courage required, but I don't regret the choice itself." The storm began to clear just after midday, revealing a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. They were surrounded by peaks that seemed to stretch to infinity, with snow-covered valleys disappearing into mist below. But the clearing weather also revealed their location, and Hassan's face showed relief as he identified familiar landmarks. "The border shrine is perhaps 2 hours from here," he announced. "We can reach it before dark if we move steadily." Those final 2 hours tested their remaining strength and willpower. The trail was steep and icy, requiring careful attention to every step. But the knowledge that safety lay ahead gave them energy they didn't know they still possessed. The shrine appeared suddenly as they crested a final ridge, a small stone structure covered with prayer flags and offerings left by countless travelers who had made this same desperate journey. But more importantly, it marked the Turkish border, where international law would protect them from pursuit. As they approached the shrine, Marcus saw smoke rising from a valley below. Hassan's contacts maintained a safe house there, with food, medical supplies, and communication equipment that would allow them to contact Dr. Khalil and arrange the final transportation to the UN processing center. But as they began the final descent toward safety, Marcus felt the weight of what they had accomplished settling on his shoulders. They had crossed more than just a geographical border. They had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by compassion and courage. The 3 sisters were safe, but their real journey was just beginning. They would face months of bureaucratic processing, cultural adaptation, and the psychological challenge of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by war. Marcus would face his own challenges as a permanent exile from the country he had served, learning to build a new identity based on his choices rather than his circumstances. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks they had just crossed, casting long shadows across the valley below, Marcus realized that he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for their immediate safety, but for the possibility that courage and compassion could still triumph over systems designed to crush both. The safe house was warm, with beds and hot food and people who understood the significance of what they had endured. But the real warmth came from the knowledge that they had kept faith with something larger than themselves. The belief that every human life has value, that protecting the innocent is worth any sacrifice, and that freedom is not just a political concept, but a moral imperative that demands action. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, and new tests of their resolve. But tonight they were safe. They were together, and they had proven that the mark of true character is not avoiding difficult choices, but making the right choice regardless of personal cost. The 3 desert daughters were no longer prisoners. Their protector was no longer a soldier bound by orders that violated his conscience. They were refugees, yes, but refugees who had chosen their own destiny rather than accepting the fate others had planned for them. And sometimes that choice makes all the difference in the world. Desert Daughter Story, Part 7, 6 months later. Marcus Rodriguez stood in a small apartment in Ottawa, Canada, watching Amira prepare for her first day at the University of Ottawa. She had been accepted into their International Development Program, with a full scholarship provided by a foundation that supported refugee education. Her textbooks were spread across the kitchen table, and her face carried an expression of nervous excitement that reminded Marcus why their mountain crossing had been worth every risk. The Path to Canada had been longer and more complicated than any of them had anticipated. The UN Processing Center in Turkey had been overwhelmed with refugees, creating delays that stretched weeks into months. During that time, Marcus had worked with Dr. Khalil and international human rights organizations to document his experiences and provide testimony that helped other detained prisoners. His military court-martial had been conducted in absentia, resulting in a dishonorable discharge and criminal charges that would prevent him from ever returning to the United States. But those same charges had strengthened his asylum case, and Canada had been remarkably welcoming to someone who had sacrificed his career to protect innocent civilians. Yasmin had found her artistic voice in the refugee camps, creating drawings and paintings that captured both the trauma and resilience of displaced families. Her work had been featured in several exhibitions about the refugee experience, and art therapy organizations were funding her education at the Ontario College of Art and Design. She was planning to specialize in using art to help trauma survivors process their experiences. Layla had recovered fully from their mountain ordeal, though she still couldn't tolerate cold weather without remembering that night in the cave. She was enrolled in high school and excelling in her English classes, determined to become a teacher who could help other refugee children adapt to new cultures and languages. Her enthusiasm reminded Marcus daily that their struggle had preserved something precious and irreplaceable. The three sisters had rented a small apartment together, maintaining the close bonds that had sustained them through their darkest moments. Marcus lived nearby in a basement flat, working as a translator for refugee services while taking evening classes to become a licensed social worker. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a life built on principles he could respect. Their father, Colonel Hassan, had eventually been released in a prisoner exchange. Though his health had been damaged by months of interrogation, he had managed to reach Canada through different channels and was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his daughters. The reunion had been emotional but complicated, as all of them had been changed by their experiences in ways that made their old family dynamics impossible to simply resume. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The young man from Texas who had joined the military to support his family and serve his country had evolved into someone who understood that true service sometimes requires breaking the rules that others consider sacred. His sister, Sophia, had been the first family member to contact him after learning about his situation through news reports. Her email had been brief but powerful. "I always knew you would do the right thing when it mattered most. I'm proud to be your sister." The contact had been illegal under military regulations, but Sophia had risked her own military scholarship to reach out to him. Over the months, other family members had quietly established communication, creating an unofficial support network that helped Marcus adjust to his new reality. His mother had been the most difficult to convince, struggling to understand how her son had thrown away everything they had worked for. But when she finally met the sisters through video chat, she had wept and told Marcus that she understood. The international attention had brought unexpected consequences. Marcus's story had been covered by journalists around the world, highlighting the ethical dilemmas faced by soldiers in modern conflicts. Military ethics courses now studied his case as an example of the tension between following orders and following conscience. Some called him a traitor, others called him a hero. Marcus tried not to pay attention to either label. What mattered more were the letters he received from other service members who found themselves in similar situations, asking for advice about navigating moral conflicts in their own assignments. Marcus always responded carefully, never encouraging anyone to break military law, but sharing his perspective on the importance of maintaining personal integrity, even in difficult circumstances. Dr. Khalil had become more than just their advocate. She had become a family friend who helped them navigate the complexities of refugee resettlement. She visited periodically, documenting their progress as part of a research project about successful integration strategies. Her work was helping improve policies for other refugee families facing similar challenges. Hassan, their guide and protector during the mountain crossing, had returned to his network activities, using the connections he had made during their escape to improve routes and safety measures for other refugees. He sent occasional messages through Dr. Khalil, always asking about their progress and expressing satisfaction that their sacrifice had contributed to saving other lives. The apartment where they gathered for Amira's send-off. Breakfast was modest but filled with the warmth of chosen family. Marcus had learned to cook traditional Middle Eastern dishes, while the sisters had mastered Canadian comfort foods. Their meals had become fusion experiments that reflected their cultural blending and adaptation. As Amira gathered her materials for her first university classes, Yasmin presented her with a special gift, a small sketchbook with a drawing on the first page showing all four of them standing together at the border shrine, looking not toward the past but toward the future. The inscription read, "For new beginnings and never forgetting where we came from." "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked Amira as she checked her schedule for the third time. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. For the first time in years, I get to be afraid of normal things like whether I'll understand my professors or make friends in my classes. After everything we've been through, ordinary fears feel like luxuries." Layla, now fluent in English and completely adapted to Canadian teenage culture, looked up from her own homework. "You're going to be amazing. You survived everything else. You can definitely survive Political Science 101. The comment made everyone laugh, but it also highlighted how much they had all changed. These were not the same frightened prisoners who had huddled in a military transport truck. They were not the same exhausted refugees who had collapsed in a mountain cave. They had become something new, survivors who had transformed their trauma into strength, their loss into purpose, their fear into determination. As Amira left for her first day of classes, Marcus reflected on the unexpected turns that life could take. He had lost his military career, his American citizenship, and his original plans for the future. But he had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he could live with himself, that his actions aligned with his deepest values, that he had contributed to preserving something beautiful in a world that too often destroyed beauty. The three desert daughters had been marked by war, by captivity, by a mountain crossing that nearly killed them all. But the mark that would define the rest of their lives was not the trauma they had endured. It was the courage they had shown, the bonds they had formed, and the futures they were building through education, art, and service to others who faced similar struggles. Marcus had told himself he would take them to safety, but the truth was more complex. They had all saved each other. In choosing to protect three strangers, Marcus had discovered who he really was. In trusting a foreign soldier with their lives, the sisters had found the strength to rebuild their own. Sometimes the mark that spares a soul is not what happens to you, but what you choose to do for others when everything seems hopeless. Sometimes salvation comes not from avoiding difficult choices, but from making the right choice regardless of the cost. As evening fell over Ottawa, Marcus looked out at a city that had welcomed them all, providing safety and opportunity to people who had lost everything, but had never lost their humanity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for all of them. Language barriers, cultural adjustments, the ongoing process of healing from trauma. But tonight they were safe. They were together. They were free. And in a world that often seemed determined to crush hope, they had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by love, courage, and the simple belief that every human life has irreplaceable value. The three desert daughters were no longer daughters of war, but daughters of possibility. Their mark on the world would be measured not by what had been done to them, but by what they chose to do with the freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. And Marcus Rodriguez, former soldier, current refugee, future social worker, knew that he would spend the rest of his life grateful for the moment when he had looked at three frightened young women and said the words that changed everything. "Wait, I'll take them." Sometimes that's how souls are spared. Not through divine intervention, but through human choice. Not through avoiding moral tests, but through passing them. Not through following orders, but through following conscience. Their story was ending, but their lives were just beginning. Desert Daughter Story, Part 5. The mountain roads to the Turkish border were treacherous even in daylight, but traveling at night made every curve potentially deadly. Hassan drove with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times. But Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders as they navigated narrow passes where one mistake would send them tumbling into rocky gorges. They were not alone on these roads. The convoy included 2 other vehicles carrying families with similar stories: a Kurdish father traveling with his elderly parents, a young mother with 3 small children, whose husband had disappeared months earlier. The refugee network was larger and more organized than Marcus had realized, an underground railroad operating in the shadow of multiple conflicts. The first checkpoint appeared after 2 hours of driving. Marcus's heart hammered as he watched Hassan calmly present documents for inspection. The sisters had been given new identification papers, temporary but convincing documents that listed them as displaced persons from a different region entirely. Marcus was described as their UN escort, a fiction that would hold up under casual inspection but would crumble under serious scrutiny. The guard was young, perhaps 19, and seemed more interested in staying warm than conducting thorough document checks. He glanced at their papers, shone a flashlight briefly into the vehicle, and waved them through without questions. But Marcus noticed how the guard's radio crackled with periodic status reports. Someone was tracking checkpoint activity, which meant their escape route might already be compromised. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped dramatically. The sisters huddled together under blankets that Hassan had provided, but Marcus could see them shivering despite their best efforts to stay warm. The altitude was affecting them all, making breathing more difficult and increasing the sense of vulnerability that came with traveling through hostile territory. During a brief rest stop to check the vehicles, Marcus overheard Hassan talking urgently with the other drivers. The radio chatter was increasing, with reports of increased patrols and new checkpoints being established. Their window of opportunity was closing faster than expected. "How much further to the border?" Marcus asked when Hassan rejoined them. "Perhaps 6 hours if the roads remain clear. But there are 3 more checkpoints, and at least one requires detailed inspection of all passengers and cargo." The detailed inspection checkpoint came sooner than expected. Unlike the casual guard they had encountered earlier, this facility was staffed by professional military police who took their duties seriously. Marcus watched nervously as vehicles ahead of them were systematically searched, documents verified through radio communications, and passengers questioned individually. When their turn came, Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold mountain air. The lead inspector was a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an obvious attention to detail. She examined their papers carefully, comparing photos to faces and asking specific questions about their journey. "You are traveling from which UN facility?" she asked Marcus in accented English. "The Regional Processing Center in Damascus," Marcus replied, praying that such a facility actually existed. "And these individuals are being relocated for what reason?" "Family reunification. Their relatives have established refugee status in Turkey." The inspector studied Amira's face carefully. "You look familiar. Have you passed through this checkpoint before?" Marcus felt the world stop spinning. Recognition would mean immediate detention, separation, and probably execution for him. But Amira answered with calm dignity. "Perhaps you are thinking of my cousin. People say we look alike." The inspector continued her scrutiny for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, she stamped their documents and waved them through. But Marcus noticed her speaking into her radio as they drove away, and he suspected their luck was running out. The final checkpoint was still 3 hours away when Hassan received an urgent radio message. The Kurdish family traveling ahead of them had been detained. Military units were converging on their location, and the border crossing was being sealed. Hassan pulled over immediately for an emergency conference with the other drivers. The conversation was rapid and heated, conducted in a mixture of Arabic and what sounded like Kurdish. Marcus could only understand fragments, but the tone made clear that they were facing a crisis. "The main route is compromised," Hassan finally explained. "We have 2 choices. We can return to Al-Muhtara and wait for the situation to calm down, which might take weeks or months, or we can attempt the mountain crossing." "What is the mountain crossing?" Amira asked. "An old smuggling route through the highest peaks. No checkpoints, no patrols, but also no roads. We would have to abandon the vehicles and travel on foot for approximately 12 hours through terrain that has killed experienced climbers." The weight of the decision settled on them like the mountain cold. Marcus looked at the 3 sisters, considering their physical condition after months of captivity and stress. Layla, the youngest, was already struggling with the altitude. The idea of a 12-hour mountain hike in freezing temperatures seemed impossible, but Hassan continued his explanation. "The route connects with a valley on the Turkish side where my contacts maintain a safe house. From there, transportation to the UN processing center would be straightforward. The question is whether you can survive the crossing." Marcus studied the terrain around them. Even in the darkness, he could see peaks that disappeared into low-hanging clouds. The wind carried the scent of snow, and the temperature was dropping steadily. They were equipped for vehicle travel, not mountain climbing. "What kind of survival gear do we have?" Marcus asked. Hassan opened the back of his truck to reveal supplies that had been hidden under their luggage: heavy coats, hiking boots in various sizes, sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, and emergency food supplies. The refugee network had prepared for this contingency, but preparation could only go so far against the brutal reality of mountain weather. "There is something else you should know," Hassan said quietly. "The mountain route is used primarily by drug smugglers and weapon runners. If we encounter other travelers, they may not be friendly to witnesses. The alternative was returning to Al-Mukhtara, but radio reports indicated that military search teams were already closing in on that area. They were caught between the certainty of capture if they went back and the possibility of death if they went forward." Marcus found himself thinking about his survival training from basic military instruction. He had experience with difficult terrain and emergency situations, but always with proper equipment and backup support. This would be different. 4 civilians dependent on his leadership, with no safety net if things went wrong. "I need to be honest with all of you," Marcus said, gathering the sisters around him. "This mountain crossing is extremely dangerous. People die attempting routes like this, even experienced climbers with proper gear. If we try this and something goes wrong, there will be no rescue, no medical help, no second chances." Yasmin spoke first. "What happens if we are captured going back?" Marcus didn't need to answer. They all knew the likely outcome: interrogation, torture, execution for him, and probably worse for the sisters. "Then we climb," Amira said with quiet determination. "We have survived this much. We can survive one more night." The preparation took 2 hours. Hassan's contacts had thought of remarkable details: hand warmers, emergency food bars, even basic medical supplies. But most importantly, they provided heavy winter clothing that would make the difference between life and death in mountain conditions. As they prepared to abandon the vehicles, Hassan pulled Marcus aside for a final briefing. "The route follows an ancient path used by traders for centuries. Stone markers guide the way, but they can be difficult to see in darkness or bad weather. If we become separated, continue upward until you reach the ridge, then follow it east until you see the valley below. How will we know we've reached Turkey? There is a small shrine at the border built by pilgrims who survived the crossing. When you see it, you will know you are safe." The first hour of climbing was easier than expected. The ancient path was well-worn and relatively gentle, winding through pine forests that provided some protection from the wind. But as they gained altitude, the terrain became more challenging and the cold more bitter. Layla began struggling after the second hour. Despite the heavy coat and boots, she was shivering uncontrollably and having difficulty breathing. Marcus called for frequent rest stops, but each pause allowed the cold to penetrate deeper into their bones. It was during one of these rest stops that they heard voices ahead on the trail. Hassan immediately signaled for silence, and they crouched behind a cluster of rocks while armed men passed carrying heavy packs. Drug smugglers, most likely, but they could just as easily have been military patrols or worse.